Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's easy to get started with the next generation of deployment and scaling, powered by the battle-tested Linode platform, including simple pricing, node balancers, 40 gigabit networking, and dedicated CPU and GPU instances. And now you can launch a managed MySQL, Postgres, or Mongo database cluster in minutes to keep your critical data safe with automated backups and failover. Go to pythonpodcast.com/Linode today to get a $100 credit to try out their new database service, and don't forget to thank them for the continued support of this show.
Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Ronak Rahman about how automating the path to production helps to build and maintain development velocity. So, Ronak, can you start by introducing yourself?
I would love to, Tobias. My name is Ronak, as Tobias mentioned, and I am the Developer Relations Manager at Quali. I am also a Python enthusiast and happy to be here.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Oh, yeah. I do. So I've always been interested in programming languages. Like, my kids make fun of me. Like, I would just read programming books, learn the basics of the language in a week. And I came across Python while working at a company that was syncing separate instances of Subversion repositories. And they didn't want to buy, I forgot what the software was called. It's like a play on the word subversion, but it's very expensive. And they think this is before Git just blew all of that away. And I had a multi-process Python script synced the repos from the US to our offices in India. And I used a couple of libraries that were fascinating. There were cryptography to have a secure pipe, to communicate. And that's how I totally got in love with Python. Just on a side note, Python is just my type of language because I'm sort of a hacker at heart. I never had the patience for object-oriented. And Python kind of feels like powerful enough, but accessible enough. It's like someone speaking like real talk instead of like professorial talk. I mean, that's how I think of it. So yeah, I started, and that was years ago. It was like, I want to say 2010 was when I first got into it and never looked back. If I have my own choice on a scripting language or something that I need to get out real quick, it'll usually be Python.
In terms of what you're building at Quali, to your point of being able to get things out, I'm wondering if you can describe a bit about what it is that you're building there and some of the story behind how it came to be and why you decided that this was where you wanted to spend your time and energy.
So I've been with Quali for, about a year and a half. Quali's mission is, my leaders say, they want to democratize access to the infrastructure. What does that really mean? Quali's mission is basically to bring infrastructure provisioning and lifecycle management to the masses, much in the same way that GitHub brought Git usage to all. Git existed before, GitHub. And we started our life, and our first product was a lab as a service. And we quickly saw that provisioning out infrastructure wasn't just something needed by lab managers. And back then it was bare metal and we were managing, hypervisors here. But now we've evolved. We grew up from that to forget about hypervisor, where we now accept infrastructure as code, like think Terraform and Helm or whatnot. We accept a Git repository and auto-discover all of those scripts and present it to you in a catalog where you can then run them and provision out whole systems. And what's different here is like, okay, so developers have been doing that with their IAC for a little bit. Now, what's the big deal? The developers aren't thinking about the full life cycle, but unfortunately, we do need to think about that. We do need to think about teardown, patching, and the evolving of how your infrastructure looks. And that becomes sort of chaos to manage with like little IAC code flying around everywhere between repositories. So we're trying to, if you will, be the GitHub for infrastructure lifecycle management.
Definitely some interesting things to dig into there. And to your point of democratizing access to the infrastructure, on the one hand, it definitely sounds very useful and empowering. And as somebody who works in infrastructure and systems management, equally terrifying.
Yeah, like, do we give that? Well, and that's what Quali's Torque, that's what it is therefore, because it is super terrifying. Even in my own organization at Quali, IT is very resistant, as they should be, to give what we call like the keys to the kingdom. Giving your employees like access to your cloud account, Azure, AWS, GCP, whatever. It can be crazy. I remember one time I got, sort of an email and some Slack messages on the weekend. I left a perf environment that was very expensive running, as I was heading out the door Friday. So these are the types of things you don't want to just give the keys to the kingdom, if you will. But at the same time, we're here talking about velocity, and which I think in general, DevOps, I personally believe DevOps is sort of a corporate term but us DevOps engineers have owned it, but it's really a corporate goal to get software out faster. And we're trying to do that safely. We don't want people just playing with knives. We want them to do it safely, and much in the same way. And I hate going back to the GitHub example, but it would be insane managing your permission files and whatnot in just regular Git repos. We all use GitHub or GitLab or something like that now, and that's what we're trying to educate and show people, that there is a safe way and a cool way, I think, to use your infrastructure scripts and still get business outcomes that they care about. And there are three actors here. We're talking about developers, but shared services, DevOps, they're the ones who are providing this platform to their internal teams. And then, of course, there's like the economic buyer who cares about cost and tracking of compliance and whatnot. And we provide all of that for those three different sort of roles.
An interesting aspect of managing infrastructure, and particularly infrastructure as code, is that it provides a lot of power. And as somebody who's been working in the space for a while, there's always the initial step of, I just need to get something out there that works. And then I need to make sure that I can do this repeatably. And then it's, okay, I need to do this repeatably and safely in a way that there are guardrails, so that if I make a mistake, or if somebody new is coming on and makes a mistake, they're not going to accidentally destroy production, or, basically providing a way to keep that foot gun away from your feet.
Yeah, you should totally come work for Quali, Tobias. You nailed it. That's exactly what we're trying to do. And Torque is the only product that I've seen. We started by you asking, like, why am I on this mission? I go to the conferences and whatnot, and I talk to a lot of people about infrastructure, and I'm, big into automation, but we got to do it safely. And if you'll allow me to give a completely cheesy example, the work is actually challenging because a lot of developers don't really care. They don't care. They're like, you mentioned, they're just like, that iteration one is like, I just want my infrastructure up so that I can deploy out to. And the way I think of this, I was thinking about it and practicing, trying to explain to my kids what I do. And I said, okay, all right, imagine, kiddos, if I came over to, some random family's house and I said, hey, you guys need to eat organic food. All right, organic food. The kids would be sort of like the developers. They want what they want. They don't care about the health benefits or whatever. They just want something tasty and to fill themselves up, right? And then, and definitely don't want to assign gender roles to these roles, but you have then the primary cook. They're like the DevOps shared services, right? They actually can be resistant to this. Like, you're telling me I have to buy organic vegetables, but now I have to change I have to do work. I have to change what I'm doing. That's always a big deal. And then you're telling me, like, maybe I have to also change my whole recipe catalog. Some vegetables, some fruits aren't available in organic selection. So that sucks. That's work for me. And then you have the financial head. In a family, it could be the cook type person, but let's just say that's a different role. The financial head here would be sort of like our economic buyer that cares about the cost of the organic food. Like, is it worth it? Is there really a benefit to that? And can I track how my money is actually helping? And I'm also balancing a lot of things as the economic buyer. I don't want to piss my shared services cook off, and I definitely don't want to ruin morale in the house. That's going to make all the other initiatives that I have to do. I'm coming into like companies and I'm trying to tell them something that I genuinely believe is good for them, but I have a tall mountain to climb with them. And so I got to show value as fast as possible before they'll even be willing to humor it. And I think one of the coolest things that Torque does is when you point it to a Git repo that has your IAC assets. Like, let's say you have it sprinkled out like Terraform or Helm or whatever in it, it'll auto discover it, So, maybe now my developer / kids in this example will be like, oh, I can get the foods I want, self-service, no problem. So that's the example I'm trying to, communicate of the total uphill battles I'm facing trying to help. But that makes the job interesting and why I'm doing and why I'm with Quali.
To your point earlier about the kind of DevOps being the term that everybody has agreed upon to encapsulate this idea of we just need to be able to get things out in front of people. And one of the key metrics that everybody wants to talk about, not necessarily measure or measure effectively, but this idea of velocity of how long does it take from me as a developer to get a feature request and then out into production in front of people to decide, okay, is this the feature that people actually want, or do I need to do something differently? Because if it's too long, then people forget about why they asked for it in the first place, or you get it out into production and then it doesn't do what you want it to do. And then you either have to figure out, okay, now I need to roll it back, or how do I get an improvement back out in front of people? And is it going to take equally long and everybody's going to be grumpy in the meantime? And to that question of velocity, I'm curious what you have seen as some of the main points of friction that increase delay or increase latency in that path where it says, okay, I've got this idea or I've got this feature request. I've written it. Now I'm hitting roadblocks of actually getting it out the door. And just like, how do you see people addressing those points of friction and some of the challenges that are introduced when you do hit stumbling blocks on the path to building and maintaining velocity?
Oh boy. I see this comment, and this is actually super good that you brought this up because it reminds me about the one thing that does resonate when I talk to developers about this. And even in the shared services, I don't want to paint them all with one brush. I worked many years in shared services in DevOps, and I did care about the services that I'm providing. But, I could only care so much because I'm also managing a whole bunch of other platforms. Here's one thing I'll say to developers and DevOps practitioners. They're frustrated. They're trying to get, software out, and you'll have some requests. The traditional ways, you request infrastructure from, a shared services team, and then you get it, right? Whenever in your life, it has never happened for me that my request for infrastructure was right the first time. It's just never happened in my entire life. And I'll tell you what, Tobias, and I'm, talking to also our crowd out here, I'd like to ask them, how many times when you have been provisioned, supposedly the ticket is completed and you've provisioned out your infrastructure, how often are you even able to connect it? I'd say 50% of the time, I can't even SSH into, or connect into my infrastructure. So, you asked about stumbling blocks and, frustrations. I would say that's my top frustration. That happens to me, I don't know, more than once. And I start thinking and really just don't want to be in this spot. You start thinking about workarounds. You start thinking about hoarding environments, overspeccing and ordering it early. And then you remember, we are here, and this is kind of an aside, we're here in the world of cloud as an evolution. We used to have bare metal, right? I remember running cables in a raised cold room. We had our servers that were mostly idle. And so now we had hypervisors that provided the compute and storage in a way that I could now make my machines not be idle, and I'm getting more out of it. And then cloud took that on steroids. If I am now making my development teams and consumers of infrastructure hoard and, overspec and provision out too early, my infrastructure feels like a step backwards, to me.
Yeah, the question of does everything come up right the first time is definitely a persistent problem, and one that every time you have to try and work with a new platform or a new framework or new components, you always have to go through that process of, okay, how does this actually work? And what are the things that are not going to work the first time? And how do I either work around them or build an additional automation or additional logic to be able to account for that? And that's another question that often comes up is how much time and energy is this actually worth? So I
Oh my
can
goodness.
build this
Yeah.
up and then it doesn't quite work. And then I can click 3 buttons and then it does, but I have to do that every time. Or I can spend the next 2.5 weeks writing code that makes it so I don't have to click those 3 buttons. How many times am I actually going to have to do this and figuring out what that calculus is?
Sorry, I was about to talk over you because it's so emotionally triggering what you're describing. Because, you also asked what bad habits happen because of this. And so people start getting into workaround mode. And I'm not sure if this is a quality term. I imagine it's not, but I first heard it in quality while trying to solve this problem. You have something called shadow IT. Sounds like something from a spy movie or something. But you have shadow IT, and what that is, and Tobias, I've been guilty of this myself. Okay, this is so frustrating. I put my own credit card down and I open up my own AWS account. Now that is nuts. That bypasses every security and safety mechanism of your corporation. I like to think I did it safely, but I'm being put in a rock and a hard place here. I'm on the hook to deliver. We're talking about velocity super fast. And I've had developers, at shows come and just tell me, it's like, yeah, I really don't give a, insert an expletive about, doing it the right way. I have a feature that I have to get out here. And that's what I'm being, if you will, graded on. That's what my bonus structure is based on. And developers are hardworking, smart, creative people. Even if it weren't all of those pressures, the want to do something fast and elegantly is just kind of built into our DNA in tech. And you don't want to give them a reason to start in the workaround. And just sort of as a meta topic, Tobias, this is like how I think I alluded to it, but I'm a parent, I'm a father, and I see this as, it's very much like a family too. I don't want to give my kids a reason to work around our rules. And the rules aren't there just for me to power trip. They're to keep them safe and happy and us to complete our objectives. But at the same time, pretty sure my 15-year-old son doesn't care when I'm harping on him about how like maybe screens affect him. He wants what he wants. And, let's not give folks a reason to go the workaround, because these people are super smart and they will find that workaround. And then you will subvert your process. And also, to wrap up that story about the AWS account that I opened on my own, boy, did I get in so much trouble for that. I mean, it was just, but I was honest. I was like, I'm not so sure what I could have done. And it got escalated all the way to the top. And they acknowledged that it's like, don't do this again, but we're not going to fire you.
Yep. And to that point of, when you have points of friction or when you have roadblocks on the path to production, it's going to lead people to, do things that are not supported or are not desirable for whatever the reasons, whether it's security, corporate policy, regulations, et cetera. And once you do hit that point where somebody says, okay, I just need to do this workaround because this has to get into production for whatever reason it might be, how does the persistence of those roadblocks or of those points of friction contribute to some of those negative feedback loops? And what are some of the ways that development teams can identify when people are falling into those bad habits and start to identify and work to address them?
Yeah, I love it. All right. So you asked, how do those habits contribute to a negative feedback loop? And we kind of alluded to it this way, but I'll sort of give my canned response. And I really hope it sort of resonates here. I think we can all agree and believe, I don't think anybody loves process, necessarily, but process was put in place for a good reason, right? Downstream effects of workaround culture will subvert those processes and risk delivering on all those reasons the processes were put in place in the first place. And now we're going to go from a place where processes help keep things in the rails and safe and predictable. But now we're going to be managing by crisis. Kind of want to go down that way. You want to address that. And I'm going to totally say something that sounds trite, but I'll go into it. It'll be more expensive in the long run if you don't manage this proactively and really address the reasons the developers feel the need to work around. Sometimes it's like, hey, is the process overbearing? Maybe. Is it at direct odds with developer objectives and responsibilities? I mean, you got to like really look at that hard. And that's hard to do because, you know, in an organization, like I mentioned, you know, with shared services and development, our objectives are different, and rightfully so. And I think, you know, then you ask like, hey, what are those signs and stuff? I think the signs need to be monitored by the leaders. I mentioned before, like, for instance, like the people I deal with, I call them the economic buyers, but our tech leadership should look out for these signs and don't get us to a crisis to try and fix this. We need to address it beforehand. I'll give an example. I have a friend that is a big diver, you know, and I was complaining one time, you know, that my ears like needed to pop. And he told me in diving, what you do is by the time you need your ears to pop, you know, and you're down like 90 meters in the water, it's like he used more colorful language than I'm going to use, but he said, you're already screwed by that time. You know, to tough noogies there, you're going to, and just like in a plane, when your ears need to pop, it's too late then. He says the typical diver, what they'll do is they'll pump their internal sinuses the whole way down, and you'll never get to that. So why am I saying that example? It's because we have to pump the whole way down. The first sign of friction, the first sign of workaround, and to my company's credit, in addition to not firing, they really did escalate. You know, I actually literally sat with the CIO and the IT leadership, and just they really cared about that experience. And we did solve that problem. I got the access I need, and not just the workaround because Ronak was the trouble kid. You know, we changed that process for everyone. And so that's the canary in the coal mine when somebody's like working around, but it's a little kind of late for that. So hopefully the leaders are seeing like, how long does it take you to finish a ticket? And if the ticket to deliver, you know, infrastructure is like 2 weeks, but your sprints are 2 weeks, that's probably a pretty sure sign that you're going to have friction, you know. And then I'm hoping every tech leader will, just like when we were talking, it easily resonated that no ticket is totally satisfactory the first time around. So I think they should also look at reopen tickets, you know, as an indicator. These are boring metrics, but I mean, that's why I'm not a leader. I think a lot of that is boring too, but that's their job, right? They're the head of the family, and they should be proactively, you know, pumping the system and watching out for that.
To the point too of, you know, the developer gets the feature written and then it needs to get into production. Another problem that I've encountered and seen in a few places is understanding what is the definition of done. Because a lot of people will say, oh, I wrote the feature, that means I'm done, I'll move on to the next thing. No, it's not in production yet, it's not done yet. So what are some of the useful ways that you've seen to either come to a useful definition of done, or working with developers to kind of give a sense of ownership to that, and, you know, owning the feature all the way into production, and just contribute to some of those negative feedback cycles?
For those listening, I beg your patience and apology, but I'm going to say the thing that's like totally popular, that's totally worked in my life. It's like, all right, so we have full stack developers, right? Full stack developers, it's like the new black dress, you know, everybody's a full stack developer. If you release a feature, I think until documentation, and forget it, documentation, I think like, you know, as you release a feature, the full stack developer is on the call chain. If your feature breaks, you know, you have to suffer with, and I'm not just trying to be like a tongue-in-cheek jerk. There's like very little way to gain that empathy. We're creating a systems of motivation that creates these sort of problems, right? The velocity has to be faster. The releases have to be faster, but then that'll create a bad habit of just like throwing the spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. If we're going to be full stack developers, we also have to own all the way through the life cycle, all the way out to post-production support.
And so in terms of the work that you're doing at Quali, you mentioned the Torque product a few times, and we've identified a few of the challenges and points of friction that developers will experience, whether it's problems with how their feature goes from point A to point B, or maybe lack of understanding about what is involved in those steps. And I'm just wondering how you are addressing that challenge of being able to build velocity, maintain velocity, and let everybody share visibility and ownership throughout the entire process.
So the problem that we're trying to solve for the software teams is, you know, we're just trying to release software faster. right? And like we mentioned before, I think that's the point of DevOps. I mean, there's some argument, and I don't fully believe that's true. I think DevOps practitioners, we now have also owned that term, and it's like a community too. But I really think the folks were employed because, and the DevOps practice exists, is to get software out faster, right? That's the point. Then these tools, and just like with Torque, the point is all the tools in a DevOps pipeline, Quality's Torque is no different. It's to release our software faster. And I'm trying to get folks aware. The challenge is now the infrastructure. We figured out how to do CI. We know how to build code like without any delay. We have continuous deployment. We're pretty mature on that process. We're starting to do continuous testing as well. But all of that is predicated on that infrastructure exists. That's sort of the rickety leg on this chair. Think about it. It's like tuning a car. We've been tuning the car for a while. We were like, okay, we cleaned out replaced the spark plugs and the spark plug wires, and it's like, oh, that works well. Like, what's now the next thing in the engine that needs tuning? It's like, oh, okay, I'm gonna change the exhaust out or whatever. And I think at this part in time of our DevOps CI/CD pipeline process, I think infrastructure is that next big challenge. And I would love to solve this, and I would love us to solve this. Of course, I think Torque is the answer to that, but I would love us to just, as a practitioner in DevOps, love to solve this so that we can find what that next thing is in the line that we need to automate and fix. Ideally, I think our businesses would love to get to a day when we're thinking of a feature, like a developer's thinking of a feature, and it goes from thought to production, like as fast as possible.
Yeah. So one of the interesting elements of the interaction between developers and the infrastructure engineers is helping the developers understand what infrastructure is even necessary for their feature to be able to actually run once it's in production. Because if you're doing something locally, there are certain workarounds or certain shortcuts you can make or assumptions that you can make about what do I need to actually get this functional. One of the most common ones being file system access, where particularly if you're in a cloud environment, you're going to be running across multiple machines. So you can't assume that any given file is going to be able to be written and then read from in the same process or on the same machine. And so then you have to say, okay, well, actually I need to push this into object storage, or now I need to assume that there's some shared file system, whether it's NFS or whatever it might be. So just making sure that developers understand as they're working on features, okay, this is actually going to need some additional cloud resource or infrastructure resource, or I'm going to have to start this conversation early with the infrastructure engineers to say, this is what I'm going to need for this feature to work. How long will that take? Or what else do I need to do? Or what are the solutions that we already have in place to be able to solve this kind of a problem? And I'm wondering how you've seen teams start to tackle that challenge of the sort of education and awareness among developers about what infrastructure resources are already in place or what additional resources might need to be created to support what they're working on.
What a great, comment and, defining of a problem, your question. So when I talk about this with users and, developers and DevOps practitioners, we call this in quality, it's called the skills gap. We have a cloud engineer, okay? And the amount of people that are going to use infrastructure, if you think about it in a funnel, like all the developers, it's a great amount of people, right? And then there's the folks with expertise on knowing how to build things out in the cloud. All right, that's less people. Then you have like the people that are knowledgeable enough in development and have those cloud skills and have the interest to do it. And those are a few people. You can't hire like an army of cloud engineers. That doesn't scale well. And so one thing that we had decided to do with Torque is, we talked about how long it takes those tickets to complete in DevOps, and you hit the nail on the head. One of those is the discussion. Like, what is possible? You mentioned like file storage. And, another one is what's the proper security group? What are those called? Like the CDNs, and what pieces that looks totally different from your local environment, even if you're Docker and containerizing it looks totally different. So in your organization, there's like a small percentage of people that can do that. And delays come from, these are complex topics that they have to go through and talk about with teams. And that contributes to the delay of getting the infrastructure out. One of the things that Torque does is, all right, so you have a cloud architect building these environments. What if they were able to do the thing one time and codify it into we call them blueprints personally, but you can codify it in a Terraform or whatever. But you have to be knowledgeable enough. That one person now can codify it, put it in Torque, and now it's in a self-service catalog for everyone. So you've basically now scaled your cloud architect. And I think I didn't mention it before, but Tobias, you opened the door totally. I think definitely our cloud architects, and they're called, many things in different companies, but just generally speaking, our cloud architects, very necessary position, only folks knowledgeable on not just the product, but how to get that out there safely. And a lot of delays if they have to do that for the whole company and they have to do that over and over again. We should codify and take their learnings and say, okay, well, we discussed it. Here it is. Here's the blueprint you use. And from now on, you can extend it. So parts that you don't know about, fine. We can talk about that and whatnot. But the parts that you do need to know, you can just click a button and then boom, your infrastructure is there.
To the question of blueprints, that brings up a pain point that I've experienced a number of times where you have all of these, pre-existing repositories, so Terraform modules or Pulumi libraries or CloudFormation stacks where it says, oh, this is the thing you need. Here, just click this button. It'll do everything you want. And it's like, okay, that's great. That's 80% of what I need. But these pieces are actually a little bit different in my environment. So I need to do this differently. Yes. And I'm curious how you've addressed some of that problem of, here's the general pattern. This will do everything you want, but then making it so, okay, these are the pieces that you need to swap out. We'll let you do that differently without having to just throw away the whole thing or fork the repository and rewrite half of it to make it fit your environment. And just some of those challenges of, making a solution fit the environment that you need to deploy it into.
Yeah, good question. And yes, that is the cloud architect's not going to be able to write a blueprint that'll work 100% for everyone. And part of what I'm proud of in Torque is that, all right, we have now taken these complicated items and codified it in like human readable ways, and if I need to alter it, and we also alluded to it this way, all of those catalogs, blueprints, and all the infrastructure as code scripts that, Torque is managing is discovered and presented to you via a Git repo, not just a single one. We have a concept of spaces. So like a space would be like for a development team, right? So Ronak space would be for the Ronak app. And I have developed a set of blueprints and I've backed it up with a Git repository. From there, I can sort of update. I can work with the cloud architect and update it to 100%. And it'll be much faster because I might not be an expert, for instance, in security group creation, but I do see it in English. Oh, here it is. And here's my problem. I can't connect my services up the way I need to. And we'll just alter it from there. Your space now gets that learning and you can move forward to 100% of your solution that doesn't affect somebody in someone else's space.
Another interesting element of the challenge is that while there might be a general pattern or kind of abstract architectural set of requirements of I need a web server, a database, and a CDN, but there might be differences in terms of which implementations there are or what APIs they each support or what feature set they have. But then even beyond that, there's the question of, okay, well, what is my actual deployment environment? Because that'll introduce different constraints. You mentioned containers. So, that's obviously a hot topic right now. So am I running this on a VM where I can actually have multiple processes and multiple different, applications cooperating? Am I going to put this into a container where I can actually only have PID 1 and that's the expectation is that there's one process running? Am I going to run this in a Kubernetes container where I have to be able to handle fault tolerance and restarts and distribution of my application? Is this going to be, globally replicated? What's the replication factor? I'm curious how you've seen the proliferation and evolution of available deployment targets influence the challenges and points of friction that development teams run into in figuring out what is that path from development to production and, how flexible or, what are the supported deploy targets that I want to manage in my environment and how do I make that selection?
Folks should be able to deploy wherever they want to. I shouldn't come in with a product of Torque and say, well, I only support, AWS, and this is where, then why not just use like CloudFormation, right? One of the cool things, and I haven't mentioned it, yet, but we're not only multi-cloud, we support multi-cloud like Azure, AWS, GCP, Oracle's offering, but we also support not just, containers, Kubernetes clusters in those separate clouds, but also we support the target of a Kubernetes cluster, like just locally, like outside of all that. So I think one of the big advantages here is I don't want to tell them, I want them to be able to use what they want to use. I want them to use it easily, and I want it human readable. That's all. And so Torque supports that. I think, for instance, nothing's wrong with, for example, CloudFormation. I think it's cool, but I just don't think it's enough with the needs of all of my software development teams. I think you can't convince everybody, nor should you. Maybe I work best in containers, and I've nailed this deployment process on, a Kubernetes cluster, using my Helm and Terraform scripts. I want to say yes to that. But then maybe a bunch of people only want to create, a traditional compute resources in Azure. I want to support that too. And we do. So I guess my answer is you got to support all the deployment methods.
In terms of what you're building, I'm wondering if you can talk through some of the implementation of how you've approached the product and the user experience around how it operates and how people work with it, and just some of the ways that the design and goals of the platform have shifted or evolved from when you first started working with it.
All right. Are you ready for some boilerplate, Tobias?
Yes.
No, I'm going to try it. I'm going to try and make it interesting. Yes, I would love to describe what we have built with Quali and how our designs have, evolved, if you will. But then I'd have to kill you. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Okay, so as we talked about, we created a product called Torque, which is, a control plane for managing your infrastructure lifecycle. The inputs, as mentioned before, are IAC, infrastructure as code. So for folks listening, think Terraform, think Helm, but there are others, including our own YAML-based blueprints. And I mentioned this before, but I just want to underline it. We accept a Git repo with all that IAC in it and in no special format. We're not telling you how to do it because we auto-discover these assets. As soon as you point to a repo, it does its, hey, I'm thinking for a second, and it auto-discovers all of your assets and then presents it to you. And it gives you a choice on which ones you want to import. I just import them all, usually. Then our outputs are basically going to be, once you select that, now you have all of your infrastructure presented to you in a list, sort of like an application catalog. Like that's like one of the things IT does. They put all your applications in a catalog and you can self-service. Well, we're doing that with infrastructure. And the outputs are infrastructure created and the ability to manage them. And so here's the big part that I haven't talked about yet. The outputs are not just created. Those are like day one problems. I'm talking about day two and day N problems. So our outputs are the infrastructure created and the ability to manage them from creation, maintenance and patching, cost tracking, auditing for compliances, and all the way to end of life and decommission. We implemented our SaaS solution by accepting Git repos, identify the IAC assets, present it to you as a catalog that you may self-serve from. Those things that now you get free with it that maybe as a developer you don't care about are cost tracking, ability to audit, self-serve from those with, like I said, we break it down into spaces and we implement a role-based access control. So only people you want will see the catalog. Not everybody will be able to go to the Ronak space and launch anything. We fine-grain control those permissions, much in the same way that GitHub controls fine-grained access to, repos. And finally, and I think this is pretty cool, a part of that lifecycle is to be able to observe and connect to the created infrastructure and diagnose and troubleshoot as well. You also asked, have our design goals shifted and evolved from when we started working on? And that's a pretty cool question because that sort of gives an idea of our headspace. And I think we saw a problem and we solved for that problem. And that first problem that we solved for was sort of lab as a service I mentioned before. And that was bare metal. And we were helping folks provision out infrastructure for that bare metal. But with all successful PLG, product-led growth offerings and SaaS offerings, you have to listen to your users, refine and rinse and repeat. So the original problem we solved for was managing automated infrastructure in software labs. But now we took that concept and made it for any environments, any cloud, and any deployment targeting VMs, multi-cloud, Kubernetes. And we still do physical labs with virtual hypervisors too. So that was our evolution.
To the point of kind of lab environments or pre-production test environments being able to give developers a space to actually prove out their features and prove out their general approach, that can be very challenging to be able to actually get the automation into place where you can spin up an entire stack, particularly when you have particular data that needs to be in place for the function to work the way that it was designed. And I'm wondering, what are some of the useful patterns that you've seen folks build up once they start to adopt Quali and have the ability to say, okay, here's our infrastructure as code. This is what runs in production. Now you can self-serve and spin up this environment for being able to deploy your test feature to. But how do you actually write that infrastructure as code or the automation to be able to get that environment to a point where you can test it without having to do a bunch of manual work after the fact, harking back to earlier in our conversation?
Well, I think the first step, I wish we could, and I'm sure we'll evolve to even do more, but that subject is a very interesting one. What we're doing is we're trying to speed up velocity by, as mentioned, we automate the release of the infrastructure stack. Great. I think the key method, and I saw this when I started working with Torque myself, one of the things that helped me evolve and get my production system, and I'll describe that production system that I started with here in a second. One of the things that helped me most that Torque did was the ability to spin it up and tear it down. And I had the observability and the connectability to my environments to iterate fast through this. So I was the one who was the expert in creating the infrastructure, but I didn't have to go through all the rigmarole of running, this. I had one place that showed me my code that was imported in from my Git repo, and I could run it and observe it. And then it's like, oh, that's not good enough. I just update my Git repo and I just rinse and repeat again. So your typical development methodology, now we're doing it for infrastructure. We give that sort of rinse and repeat and iterate over it with something that's backed by source control. And the kind of cool or funny example that I did, I was trying to get sort of my son interested, and he asked me, what do I do? And I started talking to him, we're talking, and he's like, yeah, Dad, I just don't understand any of those words that are coming out of your mouth. They just sound like a bunch of, tech garbage talk. And I was like, okay, fine. We're going to create a Minecraft server, okay, together. And it was a simple YAML. And we just created the compute and, curl downloaded the server binaries and, launched, we installed Java and launched Minecraft. And I forgot to mention this when you asked how I got into Python. One of my favorite libraries in Python, I'm sure you're familiar with it way more than I, is Flask. I love Flask. Flask is like if it were a person, it would be my best friend. So I could spin up cool actual websites. So I was able to, I don't know, it's like half a page of Python script. I also created a helper website that on a different compute that took my Minecraft state, it's just a copy of the file, copied it, zipped it, and allowed me to import it back in. So then when my son and I were done playing, I was like, look, I'm going to shut this down. And I killed it and the compute was reserved. And then I said, now we can go out and next weekend we can come back and we can start just where we left it. And he's like, okay, why do I care about that? I can do that no matter what. I was like, yeah, but now I'm not paying for the compute for the whole week. He's like, oh, I get it now. So I was able to iterate through that real quick. And I held the interest of a then 14, now 15-year-old. So I think personally, pretty amazing that I was able to hold their interest. So to answer your question, I think it's the speed of iteration has increased so fast that allows me to keep making changes and learn and improve it. Oh, you know what? We actually do. I don't use this, but we have IDE plugins. Of course, yeah, for Microsoft Visual Studio. And when you're creating your infrastructure, we have, syntax syntax completion and syntax checking. I'm old school, I copy and paste and change it. But yeah, we actually do. So that's another way we help folks create and I think that's a big lift. I don't like Visual Studio, so I don't use it. But yeah, we have that plugin too to help folks create their IAC faster in Torque.
When are you going to make the plugin for Emacs?
Oh man, I'm telling you, hell yes, Emacs and VI. I'm just totally. That's my love language. Yeah, some Nano, some Pico, some VI. Love that. I really do. I love those, and that's why I like Python. I mentioned it. My hat's off to developers that can think abstractly with their object-oriented, development, large, complicated projects. But I love Python. I can understand it. And yeah, so I'll suggest it, but I wouldn't hold my breath on the Emacs plugin. But good one.
I think that's one of the great things about the introduction of the language server protocol is that it reduces the amount of friction and time and investment required to be able to support editors like Emacs that aren't the kind of the big names that everybody's talking about right now. Right now, everything is, here's a VS Code plugin for you. It's like, okay, great. That's fine for some people, but not me.
Yeah. But you can see why we went that direction,
Absolutely.
Right? That's what our users are asking. It's not for me personally, but it is for a lot of people. It's so not for me. I forgot to, but there's a ton of folks that like it and have provided feedback. And we've actually gone through a few iterations and I've seen it recently. And I'll make an admission. I have installed VS Code on my system. It's my job and to do it. And I'm not going to lie, it wasn't terrible.
Yeah. There have been a few features that have been compelling enough to make a stab at trying to adopt VS Code or some of these other editors that it's like, okay, maybe this will be worth it. And then I spend a couple of days with it and I just can't get anything done. I spend more time fighting against it than doing anything else. So then I just retreat back to Emacs, which is where I've been for the past few years. So
Tobias, you and me both had to struggle with, I'm gonna mention it, and it might cause pain for folks listening in, but Eclipse can be the bane of my existence sometimes. I mean, the load time on it is incredible. I think, as you can tell, I'm not a huge IDE guy, but my favorite one so far has been IntelliJ's. I mean, that's still not my first choice for editing, but it's the least frustrating for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for teams that they've built their path to production, they have established velocity, they're working to be able to build and ship features and manage those feedback cycles. What are some of the potential disruptions that they should be guarding against or keeping an eye out for that can throw a wrench in the works and actually start to introduce some of these negative feedback cycles where maybe you have a path to production, but it's become too rigid because you have built too many assumptions in along the way, and just some of those types of issues that folks need to be aware of as they're building velocity and iterating on the path to production and making sure that developers can get things in front of users.
The top thing that I've seen is environments, like lower environments, for example, or actually can happen the other way too, but environments getting stale, as in not matching prod, right? Perhaps hot fixes were applied, I don't know. Environment stacks require upgrades to dependent software, OS, compute, storage, you name it. That's one. So environments getting stale. And because before we haven't codified it, or if we did, like Terraform scripts on some random person's repo, it's like, all right, am I disciplined enough to take what changed in production and bring it back to, I don't know. So I've seen that. And, Torque solves that by our blueprints are presented, backed by a Git repo. And if it's not how you like it, the cost is pretty low and you can get into the habit of updating it and then tear down the environment and build it right back on. So that's, how we address that. But environments going stale, I see that all the time. Another thing is, and Tobias, you mentioned this, architecture changes. Example, for instance, moving from Postgres to a NoSQL attack. So, like I said, this is the reason we created Torque. The full stack developer usually won't be looking out for the life cycle of the infrastructure. It's just, I want that deployment environment. And if we don't have a process set in place for all the phases of the infrastructure lifecycle, for example, like teardown or like forward patching, we will have these disruptions and unexpected costs and worse thing, defects that escape out to production. So what I'm hoping people are getting from this Of course, I like Torque and I would like people to give that a try. But the problem that Torque is solving and the methodology that we're pushing is you have to codify this whole life cycle and manage this whole life cycle. And we are motivating, our tech first class citizens, which, are developers, to move super fast with velocity. But I have yet to see really good processes for updating your infrastructure. And I believe that Torque gives an opportunity. It gives them a framework for which they can iterate on their infrastructure and avoid these disruptions. But like anything, like any change, like when people first went to CI/CD, a culture shift has to also happen too. And they have to believe and understand that, oh, okay, things broke down and I have a second to think about it. And the reason it broke down is because I really did just forget part of what my infrastructure needed, how it needed to change. And we're tech, and I'm hoping developers would agree the right way to do this is iterate through code, just like they do with their software.
In your experience of working with the Torque product and helping developers building and maintaining velocity by simplifying their interaction with infrastructure, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen the product used?
I gave that earlier example. I was just messing around, but, I used it to codify my Minecraft server, for my kid, but that's not a work use. I'd say, well, let's start first with the most interesting challenge that I've learned while working with teams and, folks that are considering Torque. And we talked about this. It's creating awareness of what that problem is. Like I kind of, with this speed of velocity, I'm kind of left in a point as a developer where I don't really care about this full life cycle, but we're trying to create awareness that this is something you should care about and this will affect your velocity. So the one big challenge is creating awareness of an infrastructure life cycle. It's not just day one problems. As the folks in Terraform say, we're talking about day 2 and day n problems of your infrastructure. It's trying to get us, that's my biggest challenge with talking to folks, is to get people to consider that. I work, in parallel with Quali's product and R&D teams. And while we're building out this infrastructure control plane, creating that awareness of the bottlenecks that your infrastructure lifecycle management or lack thereof will cause. So that's an uphill battle. It's made further challenging by folks that this could help don't have the same goals regarding infrastructure. Developers may want an easy way to provision out infra. They might just think, why not Terraform scripts? DevOps and shared services is trying to keep service levels up to provision infrastructure and not be the bottleneck to the software pipeline. And leadership wants the software to be released fast. I don't care how it's done, while being safe, compliance and corp standards, and minimizing costs. Yeah, they want it all, right? That is the most interesting and unexpected challenge. And it caused me to come up with that cheesy example of trying to convince a family to switch to organic. So it's like I have to convince disparate group of people with disparate goals on a greater good that will help them solution, but they're drowning right now. The tech I've used is got to show value quick. It's like, hey, this is cool and it doesn't cost you a lot of time and you provision software. And so once they see the value, then start bringing them along the way of, hey, this is for the greater good of the company. We haven't even talked about it, but Torque is able to, because we connect to multi-cloud, we know the cost structure of their infrastructure. So we have a cost tab. And, I think it's pretty cool that your application, we can slice it up any way you want, month by month or whatever, and say, this is how much your application has spent in infrastructure. And I think that's interesting. So yeah, challenges at this stage of our product is awareness of the problem.
In your own experience of working in this space and working at Quali, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned?
Let's see. One, not everybody thinks the geek cool thing that I'm pushing is cool. What I'm talking to you about comes after a year and a half of talking to people, and it's like, oh, right. You don't care about this because this is not what you're motivated by. You're just trying to bang out a feature real quick, or shared services like, right. How could you care about this platform when you're managing your Atlassian stack, for example? And I've learned, or I think I have a tendency for this too, but I've learned just again and again, you got to empathize with people and really understand. I think I have a cool solution, but I think any successful PLG and SaaS company has to listen to their users. It could be, I could think it's as cool as I want, but I don't matter, really. It's like I have to solve the problems for the people I'm trying to help. That's a huge learning. And it's actually affected other parts of my life. It's informed now. I think I'm a better listener with just my family and friends. It's like not my agenda. It's not about me. It's about them. And it's taken me, I'm not going to say how old I am, but many decades to get to this point. And that's another reason I love it. If we're going to talk meta topic, because I've worked as an IT engineer, and that was before it was called DevOps, before DevOps. And so then I was DevOps. I did SCM engineer. And this is a unique role of developer relations. It's sort of this really understanding who I'm trying to help. And I think it's been a real cool thing at Quality. This is why I love it. It's increased my empathy just on a meta level. And I hate to sound I know it's going to get emotional here, but I really think it's been good for me in that way and good for the folks in my life.
For folks who are interested in being able to reduce some of these points of friction that we discussed, what are the case where Quali is the wrong choice?
That's a good question. I was trying to think about this. And I mean, I think of it like sort of like, hey, when is like in a company, when is like having your own email server, for example, like the wrong choice? There are going to be like certain like startup, like 2 people in a garage type of situations where this might be too much. But then I was thinking, but is it? We have a free trial. I think the only reason it would be, too much or overkill is if you're 2 people in a garage developing software, you've probably got more work than you do time. And so you probably don't want one more abstraction layer. To them, I would say, yes, I agree that maybe bringing in Quali, bringing in Confluence and Atlassian and everything there would be a bad choice. But you're going to want to scale one day. We have a risk-free way of trying it out. There's a free tier, a small team can use Quali free forever and Quali's Torque forever and try it out, and we'll grow with you. That would be when it would be the wrong choice. I would say it'd be a choice you should consider in the horizon.
As you continue to build and iterate on the Quali product, what are some of the things you have planned for the near to medium term, or any particular projects or problem areas that you're excited to explore?
Well, our North Star has always been, as I've said before, and my leaders like to say, it's to democratize infrastructure creation, access, lifecycle management to all who need it. Remember, we came from lab as a service, right? LOS, and now we're multi-cloud. Think, this should not be left, like infrastructure provisioning and design should not be left to the domain of the few overworked cloud architects, overworked and overloaded DevOps teams. It should be self-service and easy because it's all just in service to do their real work, which is to release awesome software in a way that makes one feel fulfilled and not burned out. So future would be lots of cool things. I talked about the auto discovery feature of Torque where we can just point a repo and we look at all your IAC assets. It's to support more IAC types, more cloud backing, and whatever tech that comes out for deployment technology. And that's always been, we have a backlog and we're trying to support all of it. We don't want to tell you how to do it. We want to just be that sort of one place that you can use to make some sanity of your infrastructure lifecycle. That's the future, supporting more cloud, more infrastructure as code technologies, and all the things.
Are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing at Quali, or this overall question of building and maintaining velocity and development teams that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Thank you for asking, Tobias. This has been a wonderful conversation. I would just say, don't take my word for it. I'm just some guy that thinks what I do is cool and wants to share it with everyone. But you have to assess that for yourself. And, I love this world that we're in and the whole idea of PLG and SaaS offerings because it's so low risk to try something. Try it out and, go to our Quality Torques website, sign up for the free tier. If you run into any problems, you can always get help from us directly within the product as well. And my only wish is for folks to try it out.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. This week, I'm going to choose a mini-series that I watched recently on Amazon called The Terminal List with Chris Pratt. It's definitely a very different role to see him in after watching him in Guardians of the Galaxy, but very well done show. Definitely recommend that. So with that, I'll pass it to you, Ronak. Do you have any picks this week?
I'm a bit of a old school, and I really enjoyed, I think it was called Midnight. It's an animated series on Netflix, Midnight Gospel. Okay. And it's not for everyone. Okay. It's an animated feature, and it really talks about, and I talked about empathy and stuff. It's a mini series and it's animated, and it talks about, sort of expanding your mind's consciousness, dealing with death. And I found it very thought-provoking and sometimes very touching to watch, and actually sometimes pretty gross. So Midnight Gospel, maybe it'll do something for you the way it did for me.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share your thoughts and insights on the question of developer velocity and the challenges that infrastructure introduces into that flow and how you're addressing that at Quali. It's definitely a very interesting area to explore, and glad that you and your team are working to simplify some of the aspects of that. So appreciate that, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
My pleasure, Tobias. And thank you for putting on such an interesting podcast. I've listened to a few episodes and I really like what you're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, the Data Engineering Podcast, which covers the latest on modern data management, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@pythonpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.